Hey everyone, this is Brian from the Tennis IQ podcast. Josh and I hope that you are enjoying the content and discussions that we put out week after week. If you'd like to support the podcast and help us to continue to produce quality episodes, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Currently, we have 3 tiers of support: the fan level at $3 per month, the supporter level at $7 per month, and the champion level at $20 per month. Benefits of joining the Tennis IQ podcast community include episode transcripts, participation in book club discussions, and access to monthly masterclasses with me and Josh. For more on these benefits of support, head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Thank you so much. And now, on to the show.
And welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Josh Berger.
And I'm Brian Lomax. And today, Josh and I are going to discuss an article that was written some years ago about building a psychological profile of Olympic medalists and world champions, and look at various portions of that article and then apply it to the tennis world. The idea of creating a profile for even if you look at it in different categories, Josh, people who win multiple major titles, people who win one major title, people who are maybe winning, less than that, and then all the way down the scale. Maybe not get to a beginner per se here, but there are certainly lessons to be learned from this particular paper that could be applied throughout the development process, but we'll probably take a look more at the elite level of the sport. And then try to come up with some actionable items for our listeners in terms of how you can use this information in your own development, because I do think that there are some interesting conclusions one can draw from some of the things that we're going to look at in today's discussion. We're mostly going to stick with 3 themes. And this particular study was looking at the difference between athletes who had won multiple medals or multiple championships versus those who had only won something one time, a single time. So multiple winners versus single winners. So obviously we're looking at a relatively small group of elite athletes, because obviously to win something once is rather significant. And in the sport of tennis, we have plenty of players who fall into the single winner category, and we have a few who have obviously fallen into the multiple winner category. So if you were to think of the sport of tennis, this might be something where we're comparing, say, a Djokovic, Nadal, Federer to, somebody who's only won one, maybe a Dominic Thiem or somebody like that, or that generation of players, maybe some people who've got to finals. Same with on the women's side, Iga Swiatek versus somebody who's only won one title over the years. And, I think on the women's side, we've had a bunch of those. There's more kind of spread out depth on the women's side as far as that goes. And so when we're looking at the comparison, or when this paper is doing the comparison of multiple winners to single winners, we're going to concentrate or focus on 3 categories that were, I think, most interesting to both of us. One was on the differences in concentration between those 2 groups, the differences in concentration errors, and the differences in decision making. So Josh, before we jump into those, get into our first category of concentration, any initial thoughts on the article itself? Anything like that?
Yeah, it was interesting. I thought how they broke it down, how it was broken down between multiple championship winners and those who had just won once. And I think they start with an interesting point where they talk about Kevin Curran, and they talk about his how he struggled to just be. I think he talked about not having the discipline or the consistency to repeat his success. So I think when we think about comparing these sorts of people, I think it's a lot about, can you sustain it, right? It's not just about, can you get there? Can you do it once? But do you have the ability to do it over a long period of time? And when we think about an Iga Swiatek or a Djokovic, a Nadal, a Federer, a Serena, so many of the greats, it's not just their ability to be great for 2 weeks at a Grand Slam. It's their ability to sustain that over a decade, or as some that we've seen recently, maybe 2 decades. And I think that really is the difference maker, right? And I think, it just shows, and I think we'll look at some of the different qualities of that, some of the things that can lead to some of that consistency, lead to that sort of longevity, lead to that greatness over time. But I think it was interesting how they broke that down, where instead of, there's been past studies where they've compared more of the general population to elite athletes, or maybe they're comparing Olympic athletes to collegiate athletes, or Olympic athletes to more of the general population. But this one was interesting that they were looking at, obviously, two groups of elite athletes, but differentiating based on those different levels of success, or the more sustained success compared to the ones that reach the top, but maybe don't stay there in that same way.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I thought it was an interesting and valuable to see, because, we do see, and people always ask these questions, so like what's different about the big three versus everybody else? What's different about, even Iga Swiatek and the Serena Williams, and the locker room power that they have, and the ability to, Iga is obviously early in her career, but she's already establishing a track record. Serena obviously has an amazing track record. So what is different between them and the others because of that sustained success? Well, we've seen, maybe we don't have to even look at single winners in tennis. It could be even people who've gotten to the finals of different things. Like a Danielle Collins stands out a little bit, Sophia Kenin, people who've gotten there. But then they haven't been able to repeat that, right? Is it, as you said, Josh, is it 2 weeks of great tennis, or is this really the beginning of something? And you brought up Kevin Curran. Kevin Curran lost in the final of Wimbledon in 1985 to Boris Becker in his first win. And so I think the quote is interesting. Yeah, he was asked if this was a breakthrough for him, getting to that Wimbledon final. He said, no, it wasn't a breakthrough. And he went on to say that he had a lot of talent, and once in a while he would hold things together enough to make a final or win a tournament, but he didn't have the kind of drive and dedication that consistent winners have. Now, it's pretty self-aware to admit that. I think a lot of tennis players, a lot of elite tennis players would fall into that category. They have the games to make it, when it clicks, it can make it work. But do they have that real drive and dedication? Do they really know why they're playing, what they're playing for? Is that clear enough in their own mind? Who knows? Where I think with players like Serena and the big three on the men's side, they had a very clear purpose and motivation to what they were doing. So let's begin with the first scale of things that were compared. And the researchers used something called the attentional and interpersonal style inventory. So this is an assessment of 144 items looking at various categories of attention and how you relate to other people. And so concentration is one of those. And then concentration was broken down into basically 3 categories: awareness, analysis, or being like analytical out there, and focused. And so interesting results here, Josh, right? So when we look at the comparison of the single winners and the multiple winners, the awareness aspect of concentration is higher, not super significantly higher for the single winners. They're a little bit paying attention more to their awareness. They tend to be much more analytical. That was a pretty big difference. And then the multiple winners were significantly more focused. So what I took this to mean was that multiple winners are better at being more in the present moment. Where those who only win once, and I think we could also have this other elite athletes or the general population of the elite athletes tend to be overly analytical about things. That's sort of the first thing that came to mind for me, but I want to see what you think.
Yeah, it was interesting just seeing how their concentration differed in that way, and just seeing the different types of concentration skills, and in the article, which we'll link to in the show notes, they have a graph, and it's just interesting how with they break it down into three pieces: the aware, analytical, and focused. And with aware and analytical, they're relatively close, especially on the aware piece, where single winners were more analytical than multiple winners. But then on the focus piece, it's quite a large difference in terms of the multiple winners, and you can really see it as a jump where the multiple winners are at a certain level for the aware and analytical piece. And then for the focus piece, it really is a big jump. And I think, yeah, I think I took a similar, I had a similar takeaway in terms of the present moment focus piece. But also I think it's, yeah, as we've talked about, it's that ability to sustain it, that ability to sustain focus over a long period of time. And that could mean a career, that could mean a 10, 15, 20-year career, as we've seen with some of the greats. But that can also mean over a match. That's at the pro level, especially on the men's side in best of five, that might be 5 hours or 6 hours. But on the women's side at the non-Grand Slam level, in a 3-set match, that could be 3.5 hours, and the ability to maintain focus over that period of time and not get overly analytical and sort of lost in thought and have that paralysis by analysis, because you're focusing on so many different things at the same time, is a huge advantage. So when you can focus on one big thing, and we talked about this with Sean Brawley actually in a past episode, the ability to really be focused on what is most important. He worked with Tim Galloway for many years, and in the book The Inner Game of Tennis from Tim Galloway, he talks about choosing the most important thing to focus on, which he points to the ball, which I think is probably a good thing for just about everyone to focus on. But going back to this article, I think it seems, one of my takeaways is that one of the big differences is that these multiple championship winners are able to focus at a higher level, maybe choose one thing to be focused on. Maybe it's the ball, maybe it's their opponent. They're just really trying to be aware of their opponent's weaknesses. And I think when I see Djokovic, I see him doing that. I see sometimes he gives himself that first set, and that's what he's focused on. Maybe his game isn't at that same level as it could be. And I think we saw this actually at the French Open and his matches against Kachanov, his match against Casper Ruud as well, where maybe he started a little slow, but he used that time to notice and analyze his opponent. So I think one of my big takeaways is that one of the differences seems to be that focus seems to be a little bit more concentrated, a little bit more directed towards one point, where on the single winners who maybe have the ability to get there, it seems to be more, there seems to be more analysis happening, but maybe it's analysis of different types of things. So rather than that single point of focus, it seems to be maybe a broader focus. And they even talked about this in terms of the errors that were made, where it seemed like the errors were more made based on, over focus or over, being too narrow in their focus when it came to the multiple winners, and the more based on distraction or more based on analysis based for the single winners. So that was probably my biggest takeaway.
And I think as we look at, listeners and how they could apply some of this knowledge to their own games, I think there, in my conversations with players, oftentimes there's a lot of emphasis on tactics and strategy and constantly trying to figure things out. And I think what this is actually saying is that that's not really the way to be focused, more like the Sean Brawley thing. And remember, he told us that story about how he interviewed Federer right after he won the 2017 Australian Open. He was doing an event, I think, for Wilson. And he asked him, all right, how did you do it? And Federer's response was that at a certain point, he just exclusively focused on the ball. That's exactly, I think, what this graph is saying. This is a guy who won many, many major titles. And what's he telling you? He's only focusing on the ball. I think sort of underneath that, though, he's got a ton of experience with playing his way. He trusts his way. And so he can just rely on that. That's learned. He has an unconscious level of competence with his style of play, and he can relax and just focus on the ball. Where I think a lot of players get very hung up on what's the score, what's working in the moment, what do I need to do now, what are my tactics and strategy, and we'll see how that works out into the next category of concentration errors. But I would caution against that. And can you instead focus on something very simple like your breathing? As that's another thing that's in the inner game of tennis, is to focus on your breathing between points. Can it be focusing on the ball and learning to trust that process much, much more? The awareness one, they're pretty close, the single and the multiple winners. And, when I think of awareness, it can be awareness of your body. It could be a lot of things here, right? And it's not exactly spelled out in the article what that is, but they're pretty close either way. But I think we can make a pretty good distinction between the analytical piece and the focus piece, and there are significant differences there. So you started to allude to, Josh, how those two things really led into the errors part. So the single winners tended to have more of their errors due to overanalysis, and the multiple winners had more of their errors due to being too narrow with their focus, maybe not including enough information. So when we think of narrow focus, think of perhaps putting your hands together right in front of your face and having like a very narrow view of things, right? And that's all you can see through. And sometimes it gets so small that you're going to miss relevant details. If you start to expand the space between your hands, now you're beginning to broaden your view and you're taking in more information. Of course, that can get too big at certain points, right? Now you're not able to zoom in on the correct relevant details. But what this is saying is that sometimes the multiple winners, if they do make concentration errors, it's because they were too focused maybe on one little tiny thing and missed something else. So I think that's an interesting thing. But I think the errors due to overanalysis is more interesting. Because I think that's more common for tennis players, is to overanalyze things, which then leads to maybe even our next category. It works its way out into the decisions you make on the court.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting to look at these groups in this way, because I think this is seems definitely linked to the first piece that we talked about. Interesting to see that the errors, because obviously both make errors, and we talk about how frequent those are, that people tend to win. Even the best players in the world are only winning about 55% of their points. So those errors will come, but it's interesting to see where they are coming from. And I think I know we've talked in the past about, what are good mistakes maybe versus bad mistakes, or versus, less productive mistakes. And, what are the types of situations where somebody's going for the right shot or focusing on the right thing, and maybe it doesn't work out. Maybe they miss, or the execution's not there, or their opponent beats them in some way. But it's interesting to see here with these multiple championship winners that they often are extremely focused, but sometimes that can be a little bit too narrow. And maybe their peers, whether those are single championship winners or just the general elite athlete population, maybe their peers don't have the ability necessarily to narrow their focus in that same way. But it also shows that can be a drawback in a certain way, that sometimes the ability to have a little bit of a broader focus and be aware of certain things, of more things, can have its advantages. But it seems overall that the downside of that is that those errors can come from different places. Those errors can come from the over analysis. Those errors can come from the distraction piece, rather than them being too narrowly focused on something. So I thought that was interesting as well. I think in terms of how people can apply that, I think the ability to broaden and narrow focus is definitely a skill, right? And I think it all comes back to awareness. Can we be aware of where our errors are coming from? Can we notice when we're distracted? Can we notice when we're lost in thought, overanalyzing something? Can we notice when maybe our attention is too narrow in a certain moment, and I decide I want to focus on the ball, but then I lose sight of other things that are happening on the court. I lose sight of the fact that my opponent has one side or the other that's much weaker, and I'm not targeting their weakness enough. Or I lose sight of the fact that maybe their volleys, or a certain volley, maybe it's their high backhand volley, is really weak, and I'm so focused on the ball, or I'm so focused on my own game, or I'm so focused on my mistake from the last point that I'm not aware of that. So, I think, again, can we notice and can we be aware of where our mistakes are coming from and where our attention is? And then can we have the ability to broaden or narrow our focus as needed?
Yeah, definitely. I think anytime when we're working more on present moment focus, we can always improve that. And, whether we're focusing on something that is not super relevant, I think it could even be smaller details that people are getting fixated on and missing, even something like basic, like breathing or the ball. When we look at the analysis errors, it's a really big difference between the multiple and the single winners. The multiple winners make far fewer of their mistakes because they've overanalyzed something, which is interesting. That almost like they don't see that as maybe a super important part of what they're trying to do. And perhaps they're trusting more on that side of things. The distraction errors were basically the same, which, again, interesting. For the single winners, their errors really were fairly equal amongst being distracted, overanalyzing, or too narrow in focus. But it was really skewed on the multiple winner side. So yeah, some interesting stuff here, and it's almost like their concentration strengths, almost when used to an extreme level, become weaknesses. And I think that's true of any part of life. We have to do things in generally with temperance and moderation. Even too much of a good thing is not a good thing. So, and I think we see that here. And again, we're comparing the elite to the elite. So it's important to obviously have some level of being analytical out there. It can't be zero. The same with awareness. But I think an improvement of focus and learning to trust yourself so you don't overanalyze too much is important. And then, of course, this also works out into the next category, which is decision making. So here the scale was on, and we can kind of debate the use of this term, Josh, but they put basically two types of decision making out there: impulsive versus cautious. And I don't really like the word cautious, especially from a tennis perspective, because I feel like that's gonna, if I tell you to be cautious on the court, I don't know that I'm going to get what I want out of that language, but we can talk about how that is. So to be clear, both of these groups are lower than your average athlete in terms of impulsive decision making, right? So impulsive decision making might be making a quick decision on the fly. It might be that ego-oriented shot. I'm going to go down the line with this forehand, even though I'm on the run, versus a decision that's a little bit slower, that values accuracy more than anything. It values the minimization of errors. I don't want to use avoiding like they did in the article. They could, again, avoiding, use that word, it leads to avoidance behavior. So I think we want to create behaviors that help us to minimize errors. And so, not surprisingly, I think that single winners make more impulsive decisions than multiple winners. The difference between those two wasn't super significant, but the difference between the two groups in terms of what they'll call cautious decision making versus, between was big, quite significant. And so I would propose, Josh, that even if we go back to our rules-based thinking episode, that we look at cautious more as disciplined. And we're curious what you think of that.
Yeah, I also took issue with some of the some of the phrasing that they use in terms of caution, in terms of avoiding. So yeah, I think discipline makes a lot of sense, and I think when we look at some of these top players, they clearly have that. They're clearly not on a big point. They're clearly not thinking about all the different patterns that they could play. They're sticking to the patterns that work best for them. They're they're sticking to their bread and butter. Maybe there are certain moments where they stray from that discipline a bit, but in general, that's what you're seeing, especially in the biggest moments. So I think, I would sort of, I agree that something like discipline is more of the opposite of impulsive here. And yeah, it's not a big surprise that these multiple Grand Slam championship winners are lower in the impulsive side. And I think, both groups, and obviously both are elite and ultra elite, really, are lower in this impulsive side. But it is very interesting that on this side that they call cautious, or disciplined, or maybe more structured in their decision making, that there really was quite a big difference. And I would encourage people who are listening, who are interested in diving a little bit deeper here, to go to the article, because it's laid out visually, where you can see graphs for each of these three categories, and you can see clearly the differences. And this is based on a large sample size as well for both groups. So it's not like it's just based on a few athletes in each group. So yeah, I would encourage people to do that as well. But I think it really is interesting just to see how these multiple slam winners, who maybe were able to do it over and over and over again, regardless of circumstance, regardless of which of their peers were playing in that, they're competing in that championship. They seem to really rely on that piece of things, that cautious piece, or that disciplined piece, which makes sense. And I think if we think about a Serena, or we think about a Djokovic, or any of those top players, we see that, and we see that they've gotten to where they are because they're able to replicate decisions. They're not making it up on the fly. They're not making drastic changes to their game. Have both of them, and have all of the top players made changes during their career? Yes. Have they made adjustments? Have they tinkered? Yes. But in general, their decision-making process is consistent. And I think that has led to that, is one of the main factors that has led to the consistency of their results and the consistency of their success over time.
I think you used a good word a few minutes ago, structured, disciplined, structured. It's when they go out on the court, they know exactly what they're going to do. They know when they're in this position relative to the baseline or the single sideline where this shot should go. So they have an understanding of the percentage plays, the right shot, the right time. And the impulsive one is, I think, the one who is looking at the low percentage shot as a really viable option and perhaps hits that too many times. And I think that's when you compare some of these players who have maybe had a good couple of weeks and they get to a final. That's the hard part to sustain, is that a lot of their game that got them to that final has been most likely some impulsive decision making that is very hard to bring consistency to over the course of 12 months, 2 years, where when you have a very structured way of playing the game using your own strengths and you understand the geometry of the court and where certain shots should go at certain times, and you're very good at sticking to those things, you're going to create, or have a better chance of creating long-lasting success. And that's why, I think with Djokovic, there's tremendous, obviously, talent and everything there, but the mind, the discipline about his shot selection is top notch. And it's, to me, one of the many reasons that he is where he is today, sitting, with 23 major titles and likely to win more. Wouldn't it be amazing if he were to complete the calendar Grand Slam at his age? I'm sort of digressing here, but I think this is one of those areas where it makes him so difficult to beat because he's great at hitting the right shot at the right time. And then obviously all of his physical attributes help him to be in position, et cetera. So I thought this was a really important part of it. And so I think we even go, expand on our rules-based decision-making. Part of the reason we wanted to present that as an episode is to encourage all of you to start to develop your own mental model about what are the right shots for me based on where I'm standing in the court, and understand, the geometry of the game and the height of the net, and, that cross court, diagonal shots are higher percentage because you can hit a longer ball and little items like that, so that when you're in a position, you know how to do that. And you're going to be much more likely to sustain success. If anybody ever gets a chance to do like Gigi Fernandez's doubles method, I mean, she's a huge proponent of cross court. And she likes to do drills with players, testing them at how good they really are at hitting the ball down the line. And, in general, people aren't that as good at that shot as they think they are. And so it's understanding these things. And, obviously she's a Hall of Famer, multiple Grand Slam winner in doubles. So, when people like that tell you to be more structured and disciplined, there's a good amount of credibility there. So I think that's what we see, from these multiple winners. You compare Djokovic, say, to a Monfils, you're going to get much more impulsivity out of Monfils. Super entertaining. But, on a physical, athletic scale, when they were younger, wouldn't you put them the same level, Josh, if not Monfils, even more athletic?
Yeah, honestly.
Yeah. He's fast, jumps high, hits the ball as hard as anybody. But it's that, he's got a different flair going on. And he does some amazing, extremely entertaining things, which is great for the crowd, but may not be as good for him in terms of, winning multiple championships of any type. And sometimes boring tennis wins. Right. So it's a tough one. for everybody to figure out, I think. But the more that you build your own structure around what you're good at, the better chance you have of more sustained success.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think and that's going to look different for each person, right? That's absolutely going to look different for each person. What one player might really excel with their serve and their volley, and for them that structure means that they're running that play, they're doing that as often as possible. Another player is more of a counterpuncher. Their best qualities are their consistency, their speed, their spin, their defense, and they're being structured about that. They're not coming into net too much if that's not if that's not their best quality. They're sticking to what works. And I think that when we think about decision making, it really is having a system, having a structure, and then being really disciplined about it. It doesn't mean we're doing that 100% of the time. We don't want to be maybe too predictable, but especially when it matters most, having something that we can rely on, having a plan, having a system for ourselves, just like we would see. And I know we've talked about this in the past, just like if we were watching a basketball team or a football team and they're running a play, right? Football, maybe you hear it audibly. Basketball, still they'll run plays, and in other sports as well, obviously. But having that play where it's like, okay, I'm serving on the deuce side. This is the play that I like to run. I like to use my slice serve, my spin serve out wide. And it opens up the court and moves my opponent over into maybe the doubles alley. And then I'm really trying to set up my forehand, trying to hit it into the opposite corner. Maybe I follow that one into the net and try to finish the point from the net or whatever it is. But I have a clear plan, a clear structure, a play that I'm trying to run. And I'm being disciplined about it. If I notice over time I'm winning a high percentage of points on that, then I'm trying to use that more. I'm trying to use that on those big points, especially. So that's the piece that I think of with this decision-making piece. So I guess the question that I have for you, Brian, is what are maybe as we take a step back and we've looked at the three categories, if we were to think about some maybe broader conclusions or some tangible things that people can either bring to their games or even just new perspectives of how they approach their games, approach their training, approach maybe big moments within their competitive matches. What would you say are some of your biggest takeaways?
I think the whole idea of being more present focused and working on that on the court. And I think that's picking, little things like your breathing, watching the ball, just so that you can try to, block out the rest of what else is going on, so that you're not distracted by the score. You're not distracted by perhaps the loss of 1 or 2 points and feel the need to completely change who you are or what your tactics are. I think that's something we want to avoid. And then, learning more about what you're good at and how you can begin to trust that more. And certainly some research into what are good shots from different parts of the court, et cetera, is certainly worthy of that. But, when we look at multiple winners, Federer obviously is a very different player than Djokovic and Nadal, yet highly successful, much more aggressive and attacking than those other two guys. He can play defense, but that's not his stance, right? So he's a great example of someone who is an offensive player, but knew exactly, like what you were saying, Josh, knew exactly what he liked to do, knew exactly what he was good at. He designed a game that's very difficult to counter. And, what are his strengths? He's an amazingly accurate serve, which obviously with a good deal of pace. Tremendous forehand, especially inside out. Just the way he hits that and comes across his body as opposed to over the shoulder, right? And a lot of spin on that ball that you don't really perceive So you don't have to be a counterpuncher, sort of defensive style like a Djokovic or Nadal, who can then also play offense. So it's really about finding your own style and then putting that together with some good decisions. So to me, that those would be the kind of the conclusions I would get out of this. The actionable piece of learn to be more present, so that you can also be less analytical, less looking to change all the time. Stick with what you know. Look to build your own structure around your game, and then simply go practice this more and more, so you can build trust and confidence. One of the things that was interesting about the article, they mentioned, world champions are more willing to take responsibility and assume a leadership role. So that's probably more team oriented, right? But they take more responsibility. They're more confident, and they're more physically competitive. So those are all things that people can work on. You can work on your confidence either just through your body language, how you speak to yourself. Certainly self-talk could be a big part of this, Josh, in terms of even that could be a focal point, is creating a script for yourself and simply taking the responsibility to go do this stuff, to be committed, to be motivated to work on your game. So I think there are a lot of good conclusions that one could draw from this, even at a broad level. So curious, how might you present this to a player?
Yeah, I think many of those same things. I think the goal is when we think about being the best player that we can be, it's not reaching that level once. It's about doing that over time, right? It's not about, okay, I want to have one great tournament. It's about, I want to be a great player, and a great player plays at a high level the majority or the vast majority of the time. So, and I think actually it would be interesting to, if sometimes they talk about with studies, follow-up studies, what would be interesting to do in the future. I think it would be interesting, maybe in a tennis context, to look at senior players in maybe in different age divisions, and see if the findings were similar, right? The players that were able to sustain it, or look at junior players, right? The players in each age group, the players that not just had success once, but who was able to do that over time. And I think you'll find many of the same things, that focus piece, that discipline piece, that structured decision-making piece. All of these pieces, I think, would be consistent in different contexts. I mean, just like, in this study, they were looking at different sports, but I think it would be interesting in tennis to look at it in terms of different levels as well. The players that are successful among their peers, among their pool of players, and, junior players, senior players, collegiate players, and see what differentiates them. And I would theorize, I would guess that it would be similar qualities, because these are the types of qualities that lead towards that high performance state that we're looking for, right? It's all these different pieces. It's the concentration. It's the right type of mistakes. It's the knowing themselves, I think, in order to make those mistakes, those right type of mistakes more often, and being more aware of those mistakes that are being made. And it's that decision-making piece. So I think that is maybe what I would say. And I think, I think there's a lot that people can take away from the conversation, but also, reading it. It's not a particularly long study, including the citations, including the graphs and that sort of thing. It's about 10 pages long, so it's not a tremendously long read. So I would encourage people to take a look at it, and I think there's a lot of other conclusions that people could draw. And if people read it and maybe they draw other conclusions, feel free to reach out to us. Feel free to let us know what you thought, what some of your takeaways are. We always love it when people reach out to us and share some of their thoughts. So definitely feel free to do that.
Definitely. And I think, you could even look at this from a coaching perspective, Josh. And I think there are some really good things. If you're someone who's working with junior or even adult players, in a club or academy setting. There's a lot of things to consider for how to develop your own curriculum, or even when you're working privately with a player, how to help them develop along these particular scales. So I think it's very valuable to look at the qualities of the best, because like you said, this isn't about winning one time. This is about sustained success and really a pursuit of mastery that includes that sustained success and winning over and over again, right? So great discussion. I really appreciated that. So, and I hope everybody else listening did. Thanks for listening to this episode. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. As Josh mentioned, if you have any feedback or questions for us, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. If you have a moment, please rate and review the podcast so others can find it more easily. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. And you can also check us out on Instagram. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership, where you can learn about the benefits of being part of the Tennis IQ podcast community. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.